the end, and welcome to World IA Day. I was really excited about this topic. I've been interested in accessibility for well before I became a UX designer. It kind of runs in the family. My mom ran a nonprofit in my hometown for people with disabilities, and so they do occupational therapy, physical therapy, daycare for kids with disabilities, things like that. So I kind of grew up around it, and I'm really excited today to talk to you guys about it. Like Annette said, I used to be a technical writer for 4 years of my life, and so a lot of designers think in images or pictures. I think in words, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. I'm actually not a UI copywriter, although I do a lot of UI copy. So a little bit about what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to give you guys a crash course in accessibility. I'm not going to assume that anyone knows anything about it, although I know we have people of varying levels of expertise here. I'm going to talk about intro to accessible language, so just sort of gives you an idea of what that is. And then I'm going to give you some pretty practical guidelines for content and presentation. So, what is accessibility? The World IA Day 2019 theme is Design for Difference. In particular, this is difference in ability. So accessibility is creating things or products or digital products, websites, content, places for everybody. Not just people who can walk, not just people who can see. There's a broad spectrum of disability. We'll get into that a little bit in a second. But generally, I really like this quote. It's from interactiondesign.org. In practice, accessibility is about designing for users with disabilities. Philosophically, it isn't so much about designing for disability as it is designing for everyone. And I really like that because accessible design is usable design. If you design for everybody, you're going to get everybody, right? It seems obvious, but so why is accessibility important? Why do we want to focus on it at all? My favorite thing to say is it's just the right thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do. We don't want to exclude people for reasons that they can't help from accessing our content or our building or whatever have you. It's good business sense. So if you're talking to business people, just say if you open up your offerings to everybody rather than just people who are not disabled, you're going to attract more people. Seems to make sense. And then possibly the most convincing argument of all, no one wants a lawsuit. I've got a couple of examples here. In 2017, there were actually 814 federal lawsuits in the United States filed about, it says allegedly inaccessible websites. So someone who is disabled will sue the owner of this website, and people are starting to win those lawsuits. It's been happening all over the world. It's been happening in the United States recently. So in 2018, there's a blind man in Brooklyn who's actually suing 50 universities. So education is one of those things where you want the broadest spectrum of people to be able to access and to be able to learn. You don't want to exclude anybody. But people are also getting sued. It's a big deal. I think it was Winn-Dixie was a grocery chain. Several years ago, they got sued because their website was inaccessible and they had to settle to the tune of, I don't have it written down, I want to say it was several $100,000. So, but again, it's just the right thing to do. So there are 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide. That's, I want to say 16% of the population. As a point of comparison, there's 1.4 billion people in China. So, not 1.4 billion disabled people in China, but basically people with disabilities make up the largest minority in the world. And again, there's a broad spectrum of disabilities. So I've got a list here. We've got physical, so visual blindness, color blindness, low vision. I have just really bad vision, so this one's near and dear to my heart. Auditory disabilities like deafness, partial deafness. Mobility disabilities, again, I had carpal tunnel issues several years ago. I was a writer, so I was typing all the time. It's not good on a person to be doing that kind of repetitive motion again. So disability isn't necessarily something you're born with. It can be. There are also cognitive disabilities, which is a little more relevant to what I'm talking about today with accessible writing. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is basically the inability to concentrate on one thing, but it's not that simple. It's more like if you're overwhelmed with stimulus, it's harder to concentrate on one thing. Dyslexia is a reading disorder, so it's much more difficult to read and perceive words. And affective disorders like depression, anxiety, things like that. The WCAG, W-C-A-G, I've heard it pronounced a million different ways. I haven't yet found one agreed on way. They're basically the standard for accessibility. They're run by the W3C, which is the web standard, which is a web standards body. And they have 4 principles of accessibility. Content must be perceivable, so people should be able to either see it or hear it or access it somehow. User interface components and navigation must be operable, so they should be able to use anything. Understandable, so information in the operation of the user interface must be understandable. It should use language they understand. And robust, so content should be interpreted by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. That means screen readers. So for people who are blind and use screen readers, it will read all of the text on a page to them. And there's certain things you have to do in the code to make that accessible. So today I will be focusing on number 1 and number 3, perceivable and understandable. So how do we make our content, written content in particular, perceivable and understandable? So that leads me into accessible writing. It's writing that can be perceived and understood by anyone regardless of ability or disability. It's not unnecessarily complex. It doesn't have too many distractions. I mentioned I was a technical writer. So the alternative title to this talk really could be technical writing best practices. I don't know if we have any writers here in the room. UI copywriters. Do we have anyone? I'm the only one. Okay. So if you guys have ever heard of, oh, well, this meets AA accessibility guidelines. If you've ever heard anything like that, there's these conformance levels. And if you go on the WCAG website, you can actually see whether what you have will pass or fail each of these guidelines. So single A is the bare minimum. AA is sort of baseline accessible. It's very widely understood in the industry that if you're AA compliant, you're accessible. So a lot of corporations will go for AA, that kind of thing, universities. And then AAA is a really great experience for anyone. And I'm not going to lie to you, most of what I'm going over today fits into AAA. So you might ask, why am I bothering with it if everyone accepts AA as the standard? That's a good question. Because accessible writing is good for people with dyslexia, who are estimated to be 5 to 10% of the population in the US. People with ADHD, which are 5% of adults, there are more children. People sometimes grow out of it, not all the time. There are plenty of adults who have ADHD. But this number really struck me. People with low literacy, 16% of adults in the US have low literacy. You could also say they read at a low grade level. So I'll go into grade levels a little bit later, but I didn't realize the number was that high. You can't assume that everyone's going to be able to understand the same things that you understand just by virtue of not necessarily having that same level of literacy. Non-native speakers. I think it was in the beginning of this, the whole World IAA Day, like welcome to World IAA Day, they said that there were 6 billion people in the world who don't speak English. Now, you're not necessarily going to get all of them if they don't speak English at all, but there is also a very high number of people who are not native speakers. And people generally prefer to read in their native language. So it's not a disability to not be a native speaker, but at the same time, if you make your writing accessible, it will help them. And then people in a hurry to understand something, which is everyone who's going to a FAQ or a help page or looking at UI help text. They have another task in mind, right? They're not trying to parse through your writing. They're trying to get something done. They're trying to install Windows, or they're trying to write a survey question. Which leads me to my first example of text here. This is from Survey Gizmo. And as you can see here, we've got this UI help text here, a getting started guide. It gives you a little bit of an intro on what radio buttons are. Or even just headers. Your header has to be understandable. People have to know what they're putting in the form field, right? This is from Chase. So as you can see here, we've got an error message. Error messages are one of the, I don't know, I don't have a statistic on this, but I would say they're one of the #1 frustrations for myself. An error message that you can't understand. I don't know what went wrong. I don't know how to fix it. You get error like an error occurred. Cool. That's not helpful for me. I don't know what to do. Or things like photo captions. And this sort of intersects with screen readers. So if you have a photo caption, there's also alt text, which is not necessarily displayed on the screen. The screen reader will read that, and that's how someone who has a visual disability can perceive an image. But it's all based on the words that you write. So it has to be something that people can understand through the description. With that intro out of the way, I've got a few guidelines. And so these are sort of practical, what can I do in my job? It doesn't seem like anyone here is a UI copywriter. I don't know if any of you work with them. If so, you're very, very lucky. They're not that common. And so probably everyone in this room at some point is going to put text out there that other people are going to see. So let's talk first about content. So this is the words you choose in your writing. And I've got a little URL up here. It's a cheat sheet from 4syllables.com. It's an Australian resource. Australia and New Zealand actually have a lot of accessibility resources. So use simpler words. Don't use the word ascertain. Use the word find out. Inquire. Don't say that. Say ask. There's really no reason to use inquire. Substantiate. Use proof. I don't know if you guys have committed these writing sins, but I have. Utilize. This is my pet peeve. Don't use this word ever. It doesn't mean anything. When I was a technical writer, editors are cranky people anyway, so we'd get around and get mad about the word utilize. So when I saw it on the list, I said, I brought back all the memories of don't use it. A good rule of thumb here is use words with fewer syllables. We'll get into that a little bit in a second here. Talking about definitions and abbreviations. So I work in the healthcare industry. We love our abbreviations. We love our HICs and HCAPs and CCs and MCCs. And if you don't know what any of those are, you probably don't need to. Anyone who works in healthcare probably knows it. But there is an intersection of the people who go and get healthcare and they see their bill and they say, what's all this? What's a CC and an MCC? I don't know. So offer a glossary for jargon or less common terms. And if you have an abbreviation, at least the first time spell it out. You don't have to spell it out every single time, but you should have something accessible that people can see what that stands for. But at the same time, caveat, know your audience. If you are designing software for people in the medical profession who are going to know what all those abbreviations mean, and I'd even tell you what they are, but I can't even remember. If you've got doctors or lawyers or accountants, people who are highly technically educated and you know for a fact that they're going to know this, it's okay. You don't have to spell everything out. You might make them mad. They might think you're insulting their intelligence, but when you're writing something for the general audience, it's a good idea to follow these rules. And I'm going to give a little plug. I work for Optum. We're under the company United Health Group, and they also own United Healthcare, which is an insurance company, and they have this website called Just Plain Clear. And you can punch in different healthcare terms, and it'll give you a really clear definition written in very simple language. So if you ever see a sentence like this, who knows what EOB means? Who knows what both EOBs mean? Yeah? I need this EOB by EOB, so end of business or end of business day. You'll see EOD, but EOB is also right, but that's not what it means in this case. So this is a screenshot from Just Plain Clear. EOB is explanation of benefits. So I need an EOB by EOB might mean something to someone, but it's not going to mean something to most people. So it's good to have some kind of a glossary or some way to access very technical terminology or abbreviations. Let's talk about paragraph length. I stole this from Reddit. I did give them credit at the bottom. It's a wall of text, if you've ever heard of that term. Don't try and read it, it doesn't mean anything. But I noticed that everyone's reaction was, ooh, like when you saw that, you're like, oh, cringe, what am I looking at? Don't do this. Chunk your paragraphs, so split them up into smaller pieces. I spent way too much time looking at this random nonsense from Reddit, but I actually did manage to get 3 paragraphs out at the beginning of it. 1 idea per paragraph. So this actually comes from Jacob Nielsen, from an article written long ago, The Way People Read on the Web. It's a classic. They skip over ideas not caught in the first sentence of the paragraph. They skim. So if it's not in the first sentence, they might not read the rest of the paragraph to understand the point of your paragraph. So what I did is I took each of these paragraphs, and they've all got one idea. So we've got intro to what is a wall of text, comparing words to bricks. Walls of text are frowned upon. So it's possible even when you have a big group of nonsense, you can make it a little easier to read, a little easier on the eyes, much easier to understand, less intimidating, just by breaking it up like that. So we want about 10 to 15 words per sentence. This is good both for people who have dyslexia, but just people in the general population. So like I said, I'm a writer. I had a lot of fun making this. Don't construct sentences that are unnecessarily lengthy, or they'll become not only difficult to understand, but also remarkably tedious and completely infuriating to read through. Furthermore, try not to utilize commas or semicolons, see that utilized, to cobble distinct thoughts together when it would be significantly simpler to split them up into separate sentences. That's 51 words. So if the recommendation is 10 to 15, I killed it. Don't do this, please. Unless you're writing poetry or prose, you don't need to have words with that many syllables. Like, don't use utilize. What else did I use there? Infuriating, significantly. I love adverbs and adjectives, and they're great, but again, our goal is understanding here. When you have technical writing of any sort, when you have accessible writing. So if I wanted to read great prose, Kurt Vonnegut is my favorite author. So I took a stab at making it shorter. Don't make your sentences too long. They'll be hard to understand and annoying to read through. Also, try to split multiple thoughts into different sentences. So that first sentence has 6 words, the second has 10, and the third has 9. Much easier to look at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about readability. So there are actually tests for readability. There's 2 of them that I know of. I think there are a few more. These are 2 of the most common, the Flesch Reading Ease test and the Flesch Kincaid grade level test. They're both, as you can see, the same person worked on both of them. In general, they take into account the number of syllables per word and the number of words per sentence, and they spit out a number. And there are automatic ways to do this. The Reading Ease test is on a 100-point scale, so it's 0 to 100. And you want a score of 60 to 65. That means it's easy to read. And then the grade level test is, if you hear the sentence, he reads at an 8th grade level. That's kind of what they're going for here. Obviously, it varies by country. But if you wanted to use this test, aim for about grade 8 to 10 is a typical recommendation. And you can do this in Word really easily if you have access to Word. There are also online tools to measure this. You can just plug your text in and get the numbers. So you go to the grammar checker. You have to set it up in the preferences first. My whole presentation, I linked it off Twitter if you guys want. I have a ton of resources if you want to learn more. So you don't have to worry about taking a bunch of notes. But you can see it gives you the readability. So I measured this one. So remember, the Reading Ease score we're aiming for is 60 to 65, and the grade level is between 8 and 10, so 18.3. I didn't do a very good job with readability here. And then grade level 17, I guess we're a PhD. I tried to figure out what is grade level 17. I think it's, I don't know. It's not even a grade. So my next attempt at this, where I shortened it and made my sentence much shorter, changed out a bunch of the words. It's much better. So 73.1, if you're looking for a score of 60, I did a much better job here, or a 5th grade grading level, reading level, sorry. All right, so you can't talk about accessible writing without talking about the presentation of that writing. So there's two sides of this coin, content and presentation. So if we're talking about what are some fonts we might use, what are the characteristics of those fonts? Use simpler letter forms. Generally you want to pick a sans serif font. Serifs make things more fancy and beautiful, but they also make them harder to read, especially for people who are dyslexic. Try and use sans serif fonts for numerals. So again, if you're embellishing the letter form, the number forms here, it's harder to read. And interestingly enough, any font that has unique letter shapes, such as a handwritten font, not that I would suggest you guys necessarily use that all the time. There's no font that that I know of that encompasses all of these, but here are some practical examples. Comic Sans is on there. I almost did my whole presentation in Comic Sans, but I thought you guys would leave. A lot of people who are dyslexic really like Comic Sans because it kind of has that handwritten quality to it. It seems like each letter, two letters don't necessarily look really close to each other. But there's a few others that have been studied. By the end of my presentation, I have a link to this paper. And they found Helvetica, Courier, Arial, Verdana. My report here is done in Helvetica, but yeah, those tend to be some of the best testing ones. So avoid fully justified text. I'm not a typography expert. I've learned a lot for this presentation. So if you guys don't know what fully justified text is, it's text that aligns with both the left and right margins. I took this screenshot from Envision's blog. The content isn't important for what I'm doing. This is what it looks like. It's all left justified, so you see? Everything aligns with this side here. And on this side, it's not aligned. So if you wanted to fully justify it, you could edit the CSS, and this is what it does to it. As you can see, it's aligned here and aligned here. So don't do this. Because of rivers and lakes, if you guys don't know what those are. So this is a river runs through it, right? So you can see another one here. These are perceived as a cohesive unit. People see the rivers and they see the lakes, the big spaces. So I've highlighted those too. People see those and they're distracting. Particularly people with dyslexia, but again, this is not something just for people who have dyslexia because I see them and it looks weird. Like you can see it down here. I don't think you can, yeah, you can see my mouse. You can see it running through here. And it's not like it doesn't happen when you're all left aligned, but it's less, right? It's less prominent. So just don't justify on those sides. There's really not a good reason for it. I don't even think it's good practice for typography ever. But if you guys look at it without my highlights, you can probably see it now. What has been seen cannot be unseen. I'm sorry. Keep distractions to a minimum. So this is important for anyone again, but particularly people with ADHD. So here's a quote: although someone with ADHD has trouble paying attention, the truth is that they have trouble paying attention to too much. So there's an overstimulus effect here. If there's too much going on, it's hard to concentrate on what you want them to do on the writing that you want them to be paying attention to. So there's a reason it's blinked. It gets your attention. I do not have ADHD diagnosed, but I hate anything blinking on a page. And why is that? Because it distracts me from what I'm trying to read or whatever content I'm trying to consume. They blink at you, it's in the corner of your eye. I don't like it when things like instant messengers will bounce at the bottom of the screen, that kind of thing. The idea is that it gets your attention, right? And that's what they want. And And that's what you might want with an IM program or something, but we don't want to do this when we have content we're trying to deliver. So animations or video, or auto-scrolling carousels, things like that are very distracting. If you auto-play animation, it's actually bad for people with epilepsy. There's certain blink rates that will set off seizures. If you guys have heard of the Pokemon cartoon in Japan years ago, yeah. It had a scene with magic battle fighting, and I'm not going to show it here.
Yeah. Is it the Porygon episode where it was basically flashing red and green really fast, and then a lot of people started?
Yeah, and it's like you think that they would, because it was a big deal. It was, I think it was in the late 90s. But apparently people haven't learned their lessons, so please learn the lesson. People with epilepsy, it's very bad to be flashing things. Animations in video, you might think, well, my animation isn't that complex, it's not flashing, but just be careful, because it's a physical problem when you have a seizure, right? It's dangerous for people, so I feel very strongly about that, as you can see. Backgrounds, this again is good design. Don't make your background really crazy. This kind of went out of style with GeoCities, but yeah, it bears repeating. So these ones are interesting, navigation and page layout consistency. So if you have a top nav bar, don't move it to the bottom on another page. Not only is that distracting when the page loads to another page, but people then have to relearn something. So again, just good design practice in general, but it's very good for people who have reading disabilities. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about color contrast at least a little bit. So it says contrast at the very top there. I don't know if you guys can see, but just make sure that your text is dark enough to be perceived against the background. There are actually tools you can use to check them. This one's the WebAIM, Web Accessibility in Mind. It's very popularly used. As you can see here, you can punch in the foreground color. So that's 33333. Background color is black, it's 0. And you can't see what's going on here. I can't even see on my monitor, so I think it's the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. You can't see it at all. We're aiming for a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. So this website actually has all of that information. I won't belabor it because other people have said it much better than me, but just know that there are really easy ways to make sure that your text is accessible, visually accessible against the background for people who can't see very well, or anyone. Just don't do this with your text. All right. That is all I have for you today. I wanted to leave some room for Q&A, but I really appreciate you guys listening. And again, this is on my Twitter if you guys wanted to. I have 2 pages of references, so if you want to learn more.
So I'm really curious about dyslexics, especially with type-based font. Like the open dyslexic is pretty controversial because it was, even though it was designed for dyslexics, there wasn't any real research on how it works. And then some research papers, I actually read one that showed that actually open dyslexic wasn't nearly as helpful compared to the other sans serif fonts. I believe it was Bordana. But I guess my main question would be how should academic research and accessibility standards work together to make sure that for designing for people with keeping people dyslexics in mind?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good question. So he's referring to, and thank you, he's referring to this font called Open Dyslexic, and there's another one called Dyslexie. And they were both designed specifically for people who have dyslexia, but there have been studies done that said that they're not nearly as effective as other fonts, or they just don't really make a difference at all. So I don't know that much about the process behind designing those fonts. I would say there has been studies out there in academia over what fonts are good. So this particular set of information, it's way back there. It came from a University of Michigan study. I applaud anyone who is trying to make a font for dyslexic people. I think that's awesome. But at the same time, if we, I feel a little weird saying this, if we've got some that already work, let's not try and, redesign it unless we really are able to test with people. So the thing is, I'm pretty sure those fonts weren't actually tested with people who had dyslexia until after the fact. So it's really just a matter of, just in any process of design, really, you have to make sure that you're testing with your users and make sure it's actually beneficial. You can't just be designing just based on your own assumptions. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about contrast ratio requirements for non-text. So for other objects, and whether or not they need to be have a border or have some other visual. I'm curious what your approach to those.
There are new guidelines, so they haven't always been out. I actually have them in my notes here. So you want a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 for graphics and user interface components. So that's like form input, borders, buttons, that kind of thing. Again, this website has, if I was able to scroll down on this screenshot, I could show you guys, they have a lot more great information on that kind of thing. But yes, good point. Anything else on the page should also be perceivable. So we've got form, this isn't a form field, is it? This is a form field. So yeah.
I was wondering about, for writing alt text, is it best to describe the image, or is there sort of best practices?
Mm-hmm. There are.
It could be like a lot of things in the picture. So
yeah,
I'm just wondering.
Yeah, and that's a good question because it's really easy to describe everything. So if we go back to that New York Times image, it could be something like, I just found it. It could be something like woman on bench with MacBook computer with her phone sitting next to her, and there's some trees behind her, and it looks like it's an oak tree. I just made that up. And she's got her hair kind of balayage. Like, at some point it's not really, you're not getting the meaning of the picture across anymore.
Okay.
So it's basically write what needs to be said. So this caption's actually a really good example. It's not all text, so it is an image caption, so it's got maybe more than you would typically write, but it's got her name. It says who she is. It says she dislikes taking notes by hand, so some good alt text for this picture might be Isabella Ply takes notes on her MacBook.
Okay.
It depends on the context of what it's surrounded by. Like if it's about the forest, you would want to include the trees, but this particular article had nothing to do with that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What tool do you use for your readability?
Sorry?
What tool do you use to find out your readability?
Microsoft Word, yeah. So I use Microsoft Word. If you don't have access to that, there are several web tools. Honestly, I just Googled it. I will actually update this after that with some of them though. I don't have them here. I'm trying to find it. You can set it up in the preferences of Microsoft Word to, when you run the grammar checker, it will actually check the readability. So it's really easy. It's just the same thing as the grammar and spell checker. I'm having trouble finding it, but yeah, Microsoft Word has some pretty good tools there. It also checks for passive sentences, which are harder to understand. So active voice is like, she is typing on her computer. Passive voice is, the computer is being typed on by Isabella Ply. Like, that's a lot harder to understand. So Microsoft Word will check that too. Did you have something?
I was just going to say that she asked my question.
Okay. Huh?
Let's see, I'm going to try to ask this in a way that's paraphrase it. It seems like there are some aspects of writing in an interface that can compete with usability. For example, there's some goals in like marketing writing that actually tell you to use passive voice because of a lot of things and trying to pull keywords to the front for like SEO purposes. So there's a lot of competing goals with writing, and then from a design aspect or design product aspect, there's a lot of approaches you can take in pulling off of jargon or domains like that people encounter a lot in social media apps or commonly used maps that apps are not maps that young people are probably really familiar with, but older generations generations that don't use social media as much, or, whatever demographic you are, if you're not familiar with that domain, then the jargon specifically used that's close to that domain isn't very helpful. Do you have recommendations for people who aren't UI writers and are not technical writers or don't serve that purpose, but ultimately have to write copy for an interface and serve that purpose while also being a designer and perhaps in marketing? I don't know where everybody lives, but
Yeah, the best thing I can say is you have to know your audience. I would say in something like UI help text, it's not very difficult to make the argument that that should be, easily understood, very quickly understood, easily read.
yeah.
In like a blog post or anything written on social media, you do have to sort of connect with perhaps people who are younger and know different, what the kids are talking about these days. And it's a balancing act, right? So even within the same interface, it's possible to have different styles of writing. So this would absolutely be classed as technical writing, in my opinion. But something like this, so the error message, again, I would classify that as technical writing, but not enrolled, sign up now. That's more of a call to action. So you, obviously you want to use words people are going to understand, but if you've got some, I don't know, Chase proprietary terminology or something, you'll have to use that. Just do the best you can. Like in any answer in design, it depends. So I'm sorry if that wasn't the most clear answer, but yeah, know your audience and know what people are going to do with that information. So with a blog post, it's not necessarily going to be, I have something else in mind and I just need to figure out how to do it. Like it's not, I want to write a survey question and so I just need to know what a radio button is. It's content that is written for the sake of consuming that for another purpose or just for the sake of consumption. So it's okay if those are different.
Yeah.
Now, it's not okay if they're not legible or perceivable, so don't make it like white on white, but yeah.
Do you know if the different considerations for accessibility in writing, do they apply differently across different age demographics? Like if you were specifically writing some healthcare messaging to an elderly audience, does the cognitive level actually go down?
Oh, that's a good question. It does bring up a good point. In general, as we age, we become a little bit more disabled, right? So our vision gets less good. That was a bad sentence. Reaction time gets slower. People get maybe arthritis and things like that. In terms of the actual language you use, I don't know that I have ever seen a study done. And if anyone else has, please chime in. That's really interesting. I would say, I would love to learn more about that myself. But it's a good point that in general, as we age, our faculties just get worse. That's true. Mm-hmm.
So, I never realized that there was actually like some accessibility rules when it comes to ADHD. And I was wondering if there of any resources that can talk about like the way of accessibility for people with ADHD.
Mm-hmm. I've got a bunch at the end of this. Let's just scroll, and I don't want to flash it in front of you guys. There's one, and I can't remember the name of it exactly. It's ADD.org. I think it's something like Attention Deficit Disorder Association or something like that. And they have a lot of good, just general ADD resources. There's a lot of resources just specifically accessible writing, and a lot of them will speak directly to it. So there is a lot out there, yeah.
So you showed an image that was static for which we could write alt text when the app goes live. What about a more challenging situation like when you're generating charts, like pie charts or bar charts on the fly, like the user enters some values and then sees some bar chart or pie chart? Have you run across any tools that allow us to translate that, to create alt text on the fly?
I don't know of any tools out there. I do know it's definitely a challenge, especially if you have dynamic content on your page, to write captions like that. In the back of my head, do you have one?
Yeah, the solution would be to provide an alternative method for that. I've run across issues where someone generated a pie chart, SVG pie chart on the fly, and it had like a billion things in it, and those slices of pie, whatever. And so the solution was that we recommended to them just to get a table, a simple table, because you can just bury it down on the table, and have a, you know, it goes back to your earlier point to like make sure that it's obvious that people can click and hide the SVG chart or pie chart or whatever, and have a table at this point.
Yeah, and another thing you could potentially do, this might be harder to do on the fly, but you could pull out like the top 3. If it's a pie chart with a billion pieces, I mean, that's not usable by anyone. So you could say, here are our top 5 or something, and like he said, put it in a table. In that case, I would question why you need the pie chart in the first place, but sometimes you do for whatever reason, so yeah.